Hey everyone, welcome back. In my last and also first video, I talked about the possibility of doing these semi-regularly. Cut to 6 months later, and I'm finally putting out my second one. Turns out, finding the time to play a game, do research, write a script, record video and audio, edit it all together, it's a really time-consuming process. It's no coincidence that I put out my first one at the beginning of winter break when I finally got a chance to catch my breath after teaching for the semester, and this second one is coming out at the beginning of my summer break. Over a year in quarantine has made me reflect on my life trajectory and all the things I still want to do while I have time for it. And writing either or both for and about games is something that I've just always dreamed of. I still have pretty limited time. I have a full-time job as a teacher. I'm in a band. I've been talking and we're currently working pretty intensively to write and start recording a new album. I'm trying to dip my toes back into organizing and actually feel like I'm a part of the city that I live in again. I've got other writing projects I'm working on. And on top of that, in my heart, all I ever want to do is lay around and hang out with my friends and play video games all day. And I figure I gotta indulge that part of myself from time to time if I want to stay sane. So the goal that I'm gonna try to stick to is one video per month, and we'll see how this goes. I've got ideas for different types of video game related essays, from in-depth research pieces to fairly low effort Andy Rooney style rants, to videos like the one you're watching right now, which is a pretty intensive thematic analysis of a game I just recently finished, which is Disco Elysium: The Final Cut. And hopefully by speaking it out loud, I can make this actually happen. We'll just see. Before I get into this review, I'll issue a few warnings. First is a general content one. Disco Elysium is an unflinchingly dark game that delves into most difficult topics I can think of off of the top of my head. Racism, sexism, homophobia, addiction, suicide, fatphobia, sexual assault, murder, lynching, fascism, probably honestly several other things as well. I'll be touching on all of these things in my examination of the game's plot and themes, which leads to my next warning: spoilers. I'll be thoroughly digging into what happens in this game all the way up to the end. It's a fantastic game, easily one of the best and most personally important games I've played in the last few years, and if you're up for a few dozen hours of dialogue-heavy RPG that's equal parts depressing and hilarious and insightful, I can't recommend it enough. One other thing that's worthwhile mentioning is that this is a very open-ended game. You're constantly making decisions, what to say, who to talk to, and which leads you choose to pursue, and when to do it within the few days you have to solve the case in Martinez. Some of these decisions are meaningful but ultimately fairly surface-level role-playing options that allow you to decide exactly what kind of person Harriet Dubois, your player character, is. Others much more significantly shape the way that the story goes, and quite a few of them are determined by skill checks that are ultimately decided by random dice rolls, but are helped or hurt significantly by which of the game's 24 skills you've chosen to put points into. You're also free to follow different political paths, which don't necessarily radically shape the overall plot trajectory, but do very much shift the game's thematic focus. So it should be understood that most of what I'll be discussing in this video is a result of the decisions that I made as a player, though I will on occasion mention other possible paths that I did not personally pursue. So I actually bought Disco Elysium not too long after it came out originally back in October of 2019, but I barely played it at the time. One thing I can say for this game is it absolutely pulls no punches in letting you know exactly what you're in for tonally in its opening couple hours. The game begins with a discussion between you, your brain, and your body, both of which are trying desperately to convince you to die, or at least continue existing in unconscious post-blackout oblivion. That there's nothing worth returning to in the sad, painful real world you've temporarily managed to escape through an alcohol-induced bout of complete retrograde amnesia. And it turns out that they might have a point. When you eventually do awaken, you're forced to resume the life you have no memory of, that of an alcoholic cop who came to the district of Martinez to investigate a lynching, but apparently spent the couple days you were there doing little other than getting absurdly drunk and harassing anyone who crossed your path. After getting chewed out by the hotel manager and meeting your new partner, the indefatigable Kim Kitsuragi, you go to examine the body, only to be called homophobic slurs by a nightmare child named Kuno and start uncontrollably vomiting when you get anywhere near the rotting body, still hanging from the tree. And that's about the point that I decided to dip out the first time I attempted playing this game. It's an honest and daring and intentionally repulsive introduction to the world of Elysium. If you can stomach these opening moments, you're probably ready for any other bleak reveals it has in store for you, and if you can't, then the game wastes no time in convincing you that this may not be the game for you. At the time, this was the conclusion that I came to for myself. But so many people so emphatically sang its praises that I knew I'd have to give it another shot eventually, and the final cut, a reworked version of the game that is now fully voiced, offered the perfect excuse for that with its release at the end of March. Now that I've finished the game, I still think the opening is appropriately aggressive. There's no shortage of equally uncomfortable or upsetting moments throughout the rest of its runtime, but it also gives next to no hint of the cautious but powerful sense of hope that lies at the heart of the game. The way that this hope reflects off of the grim and cynical world of Elysium is how it achieves its compelling atmosphere of bleak beauty. The painterly visuals and novelesque writing combine with its open-hearted post-rock score, one of the few aspects of the game not buried under at least one layer of irony or pessimism, revealing the potent pathos nearly bursting from beneath the game's hard-boiled exterior. At its core, Disco Elysium is a game concerned with exploring the various ways people perceive, interpret, and move within the world around them. True to reality and not the funhouse mirror we're sometimes used to interpreting media through, the political bleeds into the personal and vice versa. The game takes place 50 years after a failed communist revolution, after which a coalition of capitalist nations occupied the city of Revachol, and the people in the derelict district of Martinez are haunted by the trauma of history. There are four major political ideologies in this world: fascism, the hyper-capitalist ultra-liberalism, the religious centrism of moralism, and communism. There are several characters that represent each ideology, and the player can choose where Harry fits into the spectrum. From my understanding, the Estonian developers of this game, Zaum, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, are unambiguously leftists. They did shout out Marx and Engels at the Game Awards. But while this is readily apparent throughout the game, the other ideologies presented are not shallow caricatures. Disco Elysium is abundantly concerned with how people get swept up in and locked into their worldviews, and the often ugly or tragic consequences that follow. This means that frank, difficult political discussions are everywhere in this game. Something that can feel both refreshing and shocking in contrast to the mainstream culture we've gotten used to in video games. Just recently, Ubisoft once again attempted to trot out their usual line about their upcoming game, Far Cry 6, that despite being about a Cuba-like revolution, the game isn't political or isn't trying to make a political statement. While almost certainly a safeguard against the typical reactionary gamer lament that game developers need to stop putting politics in their games, an act that a game like Disco Elysium proves to be impossible, it feels like such a blatantly disingenuous disclaimer at this point that I'm not sure if there were any corners of the internet that didn't join in the collective groan against their almost parodical attempts to use it once more. By comparison, Disco Elysium is proudly loud and abrasive in its political ambitions. It's unconcerned with upsetting the reactionary end of potential players, but it's equally unconcerned with attempts at what those reactionary players might call political correctness. Though the typical reaction against political correctness is a misguided belief that being aware and respectful of people's differences is somehow an infringement on free speech and that we should be allowed to say intentionally and blatantly offensive things without any social consequences, I've come to use the term quite cynically as well, in reference to a corporate tendency to avoid conflict or superficially appeal to marginalized people. For example, June is Pride Month, and we've seen no shortage of brands temporarily displaying rainbow logos despite evidence of discriminatory actions against LGBT+ employees or customers. Coming from a small and new developer from Northern Europe, Disco Elysium is distinctly free of such forms of political correctness. One of the first major obstacles that you must overcome is getting past Measurehead, an imposing Seminese supremacist who will lecture you about his advanced racial theory, a disturbingly detailed ranking of races, from what he considers most superior to what he considers most degenerate. Complicating matters even more, he's dark-skinned, so his ideology doesn't even comfortably map onto our conceptions of white supremacy, though it does come off as similarly vile. Measurehead is one of the clear examples the game offers of fascism, but what's particularly notable here is that he's actually working for the Union, the most left-leaning organization Martinez has. The Union has a somewhat diverse makeup, though the majority seem to be white, including those in leadership positions, so Measurehead's place in this group seems contradictory. Except for the one thing that he has in common with the Union, their antagonistic relationship with the Coalition. The Union's objection to the moralist leaders of Revachol is, of course, political. They despise the solitary grip the Coalition maintains on the status quo, which disempowers workers. Measurehead's objection has more to do with the Coalition being foreigners, reflecting the way that real-world far-right racists object to neoliberal capitalism because of its emphasis on globalism or multiculturalism. So is the game trying to implicate the Union and therefore the real-world left for its tenuous but apparent alignment with this fascist? No, I don't think so, but I think it is trying to accurately represent the complicated ways that ostensibly oppositional ideologies interact with one another. In this sense, it dives headfirst into uncomfortable topics that most games wouldn't and frankly shouldn't touch. It takes real skill to navigate this territory without mishandling it, and by and large, Disco Elysium pulls this feat off remarkably. The major ongoing conflict in Martinez, which the player must navigate, is that between Wild Pines Corporation and the Dock Workers Union that is currently actively striking against the company. I have to assume that most players, myself included, are going to be naturally predisposed to side with the union, but Disco Elysium, as we've come to expect, complicates this dynamic. To be clear, this isn't the BioShock, Bethesda, Rockstar-style cynicism of both sides are equally bad, but given the level of corruption key to understanding this world, it would be disingenuous to have unambiguously good or bad factions to root for or against. It could be tricky territory to paint a union as being corrupt, particularly here in the US, where neoliberal propaganda has so successfully turned so many people against unions for those exact concerns. But Disco Elysium is a game that thrives in wading into tricky territory, and in this instance, as with most others, it successfully manages to present a meaningfully complicated and nuanced situation without falling into dangerous or played-out tropes. In many ways, the Union is a force for good in Martinez, even if so much of even the good they do feels dirty, underhanded, and selfishly motivated. They work to raise the standard of living for their members. Their latest demand is every worker a member of the board. A bold push for worker control of the means of production. The thing is, this doesn't feel even remotely like a demand that Wild Pines would consider giving into, and it's not particularly apparent that any union member actually even believes it possible themselves. So we're left to wonder what the true goal of this tactic is, and the answer almost certainly comes down to increasing the personal control and influence that Everard Clare, the union boss, holds in the town across a broad spectrum of political and business dealings he has his hands in. Everard has you do some favors for him, and the one I sat on the longest was helping him gather signatures for building a youth center. What this actually means is coercing a couple people to allow themselves to be driven out of their homes in the fishing village in order to build this youth center. Your two marks respond with similar amounts of foresight about what they're actually signing up for, but with different degrees of ambivalence. Lillian, a fisherwoman with children of her own, understands the likely consequences and Everard's selfish motivations, but feels building a place for her kids to hang out around when they get a little older may allow them to avoid the natural course of drugs, alcohol, and other traps kids in this rundown village almost universally fall into at a certain age. The washerwoman is more obstinate, similarly recognizing the unpromising future that lays in store for the village if no change were to occur, but remaining too prideful to let Everard have his way with her land. With enough pressure, though, she too acquiesces, as I eventually discovered. I didn't want to gather these signatures. It felt wrong. When I ultimately did, it was less because I felt certain that the positive effects of the youth center project would outweigh the negative, and more because I wanted Everard on my side, and I was worried about what would happen if I failed to do this for him. I managed to walk away from the game feeling mostly pretty good about my character's political compass and many of the decisions that I made, but this wasn't one of them. Everett and the Union also have their hands in the drug trade, managed by Ruby and her network of lorry drivers in competition with notorious gangster La Puta Madre. And it's here that the distorted benevolence of Everard's dealings start to become clear. Martinez is a forgotten town in Revachol, still reflecting the devastation that the war half a century ago wreaked on it. The Revachol Citizens Militia, the police force you're a part of, have very little presence in this area because of a dispute over whose jurisdiction the area actually falls under. Such an area would seem ripe for heavy gang influence, but the firm grip that Everard maintains on the town seems to work quite well at keeping the gangs at bay. Pushing drugs on already economically depressed people can obviously be devastating to a community, but at the same time, drugs will always find a way into people's hands one way or another, and the best solution is always decriminalization and regulation, providing a relatively safe way for people to access drugs. On which end of the scale the union's model falls isn't necessarily made 100% clear, but they certainly wanted to convince me it was the latter, and in this particular case, I was inclined to believe them. Similarly, and probably most significantly, the union offers a community-run alternative to a police force in the form of Titus Hardy's Hardy Boys. Hardy and his boys are a tough crew that spend most of their time drinking at the Whirling in Rags, the hotel that you're staying in, but they also are a major source of protection and advocacy for Martinez. They're the ones who staged the lynching of Lely, the mercenary who was mysteriously shot while in bed with Clausier, in order to protect Clausier from being implicated in the murder, despite the fact that she wasn't even a local. After I met with the Pigs, the mentally ill woman who was in possession of my gun and believed herself to be a police officer, I told Titus about her, and he assured me that the Hardy Boys would help her, as he believed it their duty to do with all citizens of Martinez. When the scab organizing mercenaries finally decide they're done waiting to exact revenge for the death of their comrade, the Hardy Boys, plus me and Kim, are the only people willing to stand up to their tribunal. They don't actually stand much chance against a well-armed and well-armored group with extensive military training and experience, but they're willing to die for their city trying. And several or potentially all of them do, depending on how the confrontation goes for you. For me, Titus, at least, survived, and we ended up sharing a deep level of respect for each other, recognizing each other as people who did their duty and stood their ground against insurmountable odds. One last thing about Everard, he's also emblematic of one of the game's few true problems, which is its pervasive fatphobia. As I've already made clear, Disco Elysium tackles many difficult topics with equal parts frankness and insight. Though there are many explicitly racist characters, for example, including Harry if you choose to play him that way, the game manages to never come across as racist itself. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for its depiction of fat characters. It makes sense to an extent that a group of tough guy assholes like the Hardy Boys would poke fun at Angus's weight, but I'm not sure why the narrator also needs to call so much attention to it. Everard, likewise, is not just depicted as fat, but as comically, grotesquely fat, with his eyes bulging out the sides of his face. It's not too different from the way that other games and media have used the fatness of its villains as shorthand for greediness, and an odd stumble for a game that generally comes off as so thoughtful. It's fitting here to contrast Everard with the Wild Pines representative, Joyce Messier, another wrinkle in the corporation versus union dichotomy the game presents. Joyce should be a natural fit as one of the game's major villains, and in many ways she is. A wealthy, self-professed, ultra-liberal, which I interpreted as not particularly different from neoliberal, a proponent of and beneficiary of unfettered capitalism, here to secure the interests of Wild Pine's stakeholders. Her company originally hired the mercenaries to put an end to the strike, though they have since gone rogue. And yet, whenever you're in conversation with her, Joyce doesn't particularly come across as an antagonist. She is, in several senses of the word, attractive. She strikes a figure together with her boat, and her voice conveys both intelligence and empathy. Everett always gives you the impression that he's scheming and deceiving, feeding you barely concealed lies, smoothed over with patronizing compliments in order to get you to do what he wants. Joyce, for whatever else she may be, is honest about her intentions in Martinez, what she wants from you, and even when she has made mistakes. She doesn't disguise her surprise at your amnesia-induced general knowledge questions, but she also betrays no hint of judgment in her genuine responses. Even the way she describes her contemptible political ideology effectively conveys what makes it so tempting. The game is generally good at this across the board. But as nice as it may be to talk to Joyce, she does nothing good for Martinez. She wasn't the person to call in the mercenaries, and she has nothing to do with the murder that triggered their turn, but it's her job to clean up this mess, and the most she does is pass the responsibility on to you, while also coercing you into digging up info about Everard's drug trade. When the tribunal comes to a head, Titus and his men are there to do what they can. Even Gart, the hotel manager, is too, but Joyce sails away never to be seen again. She refuses to risk her own safety and most likely considers the outcome of the tribunal, the majority of the people on both sides of the showdown being dead, to be acceptable, probably even preferable. This is the starkest contrast between Everard and Joyce. Everard may be self-serving and duplicitous, but he's also an active member of the Martinez community who helps the town in many meaningful ways. Joyce is loyal only to herself and the corporation she represents, and poses a real and present threat to the people of Martinez. So, at this point, we've seen how several of the ideologies of this world are represented by various characters in the game. Measurehead is a fascist, Joyce is an ultra-liberal, Everard is, well, maybe not a communist, but certainly left-leaning. We'll get into some more details about the game's presentation of communism soon enough. We haven't talked much, though, about the most likable character in the game, your partner, Kim Kitsuragi. Sweet, sweet Kim. He's about the best partner a fuck-up like Harry can ask for. Patient, kind, and above all, a consummate professional. Kim takes his job very seriously. He knows the rules, follows the procedures, and is an authoritative guide to doing good police work. You'd think that given that, he'd have nothing but contempt for me, a cop who literally can't remember anything and is constantly asking dumb questions, saying inappropriate things, and following ridiculous leads. And he certainly doesn't hide his exasperation at these things. I spent a long amount of time in this game talking to and working with a couple of cryptozoologists on the hunt for a rare and almost certainly fictional cryptid called the Insulindian phasmid, and each step in this seemingly fruitless quest brought out another level of annoyance in Kim's voice as he begged me to drop this bullshit and focus on solving the murder. And yet, he remained a loyal friend and partner throughout the entire game. He never doubted my ability as a cop, treated my addiction and my amnesia with genuine sympathy, and always seemed willing to place his trust in me, no matter how unearned that trust seemed to be from my perspective. So, what ideology does this angel of a man represent? Well, he's a cop. And cops exist in order to protect the interests of those in power, protecting capital and the status quo, so obviously, like most members of the RCM, he's a moralist, as a reflection of the coalition that he represents. Yes, Kim is a centrist. And it always hurts to realize when the people that you like are centrists. even more so when they're otherwise such a good person that their existence seemingly makes a compelling argument for the appeal of centrism. At one point, I put on a pair of pants that tried to convince me to be a centrist. Oh, yeah, I haven't mentioned that yet, huh? You find lots of different outfits you can wear in this game, all of which contain different combinations of small stat boosts that are helpful for specific skill checks, and occasionally you will receive a pair of clothing that is strongly imbued with a particular ideology and gives you the option of internalizing that ideology. I do love that for however thoughtful and complex and realistic this game feels in presentation, it doesn't stray away from some occasionally ridiculous video game mechanics. Anyway, the main argument that the Kingdom of Conscious Thought tried to present to me is that, and I am paraphrasing from memory here, progress is something that is best done in small increments. So small, in fact, that it's hard to perceive that progress is happening. Kind of sounds like the progress in this situation is just actually theoretical, maybe even non-existent? Just like with the other complicated dynamics we've seen play out between characters and the ideologies they believe in, this one makes a lot of sense once you dive below the dissonance at the surface. The game puts you in the position of a cop, and though it is lovingly indebted to the tradition of detective fiction, it wouldn't really be right if the organization you represented were actually in any way the good guys. We've talked about the tricky territory this game navigates, and it's once again tricky territory to even present individual good cops. But however much I believe all cops are bastards and that we need to abolish the police, there's a couple things that need to be recognized here. First, this game is not made by Americans, and it's not meant to take place in any sort of American analog. It would be a mistake to expect my perception of police to completely align here. The cops are not presented as a benevolent organization in this game, of course. No one really is. But they're also not presented as necessarily having the exact same structural issues that American police have, though they certainly do have some of them. And as discussed before, despite taking clear political stances, this game is allergic to black and white depictions. Politics are messy and convoluted and confusing, and this game effectively conveys the way people conceptualize political theory, given all of that. Regardless of political position, nobody believes themselves to be a villain. Measurehead believes his horrid conceptions about race are, in fact, science. Likewise, Kim seems to have a logical and understandable basis in his chosen ideology. Being a communist is depressing. It means having to look at the cruel reality of gross inequality and injustice to recognize the balance of power is such that you have little hope of righting any of those wrongs, and yet to wake up every day and somehow find the strength within yourself to attempt just that. Compared to that, centrism rules. It's a warm blanket over your conscience, insulating and blocking you from the cold realities beyond. It assures you that you're right, that your country is right, that popular propaganda is right. Is the world perfect? No, of course not. There are plenty of problems, but we'll deal with those problems eventually through reason and judiciousness and compromise. Does Kim believe all of that is true? It's hard to say. I don't think he ever actually gives that explanation, though the pants certainly do. What I think Kim really believes is what most people believe, that he doesn't really have time to think about that stuff, that he's too preoccupied with his own responsibilities, being one individual good cop, and conceptualizing the larger system that he plays an ultimately insignificant part of is just kind of a waste. Here we glean an important reminder that ignorance or indifference is always a political act, even if it's presented as the absence of a political act. Kim may not evangelize the way that the pants do, or provide wonkish excuses for the coalition's actions the way the Sunday Friend does. Sorry, I don't really think I've got time to dig deeper into that one. But he acts as a loyal tool of the state nevertheless, no matter how likable and good of an individual he may be. Kim may reflect the platonic ideal of an RCM officer, but Harry doesn't. At least, not my version of Harry. With his amnesia and his drinking problem, I'm not sure if any player's version of him does, but you certainly do have the option of aligning your politics with your partners if you so choose. But my Harry was a communist. Obviously. And when I talk about the hope that I really do think resides at the heart of this game, it's with the caveat that you may have to choose this option to really fully see it. The game certainly provides you with other options, each of which seem to be fairly insightful. Last month, Waypoint published an article called "The Scathing Portrait of the Pro-Fascist" in Disco Elysium: The Final Cut, a delve into writer Andreas Inderwildi's fascist playthrough of the game. The article reads, "The seeds are already there, and if we choose to steer Harry towards fascism, we highlight that part of his personality that feels abandoned and left behind, humiliated and betrayed by his ex-lover and the world as a whole. Half aware of his own failures and responsibilities, but deathly afraid to face them, fascist Harry flees into self-pity, fueled by a fantasy of the good old days, taken from him forever. Fascism, being marked by a need to compensate for humiliation, promises easy solutions to someone like Harry. It's a crutch to prop up threatened masculinity, a rhetoric to shift blame for personal failings to ominous outside forces." In this sense, Disco Elysium provides a realistic and terrifying depiction of how someone in Harry's position can succumb to the allure of far-right ideology. And it's clear that this kind of playthrough is decidedly even more bleak than the one I experienced. And I experienced a fairly bleak game already. As I understand it, political alignments were included in the original release of the game, but it wasn't until the final cut that they added political vision quests. Quest lines that actually pay off the ideology your character chooses to follow, beyond mere flavor text. In the Communist quest, you end up befriending two students who run a book club dedicated to reading Mazovian socioeconomics. There's a character in the lore named Kraz Mazov who is basically their Karl Marx. These students, Steban and his partner who the game calls Echo Maker, are presented in a somewhat satirical manner, but not nearly bitingly so as many of the other send-ups the game indulges in. They're passionate about making the world a better place, but have made their book club so secretive and exclusive that they're the only ones who have actually qualified to be a part of it. They discuss real issues mixed in with esoteric theory and accusations that other schools of communism are secretly liberals. They decide to let you in on their book club, and the reading they assign you has to do with the concept of inframaterialism. This is a fantastical belief that thoughts are not contained within one's head, but have real, if infinitesimal, power to shape the reality around them, and that if enough people were to have an overwhelming belief in something, say communism for example, they could actually manifest it into reality. When you return to these students, your discussion about this seemingly absurd concept leads to the following exchange, worth quoting in full here.
The question you mean to ask is both very complicated and incredibly simple. Take a deep breath. Best to go one piece at a time. The young man waits patiently for you to finish.
Yes?
Say it. The young man considers your words for a minute. You're witnessing his ironic armor melt before you. This is his true self you're seeing now. There's something going on in there, but his innermost sanctum is still beyond your reach.
The theorist Buncher and Watman, not inframaterialists, but theorists nonetheless, say that communism is a secular version of Pericanasian theology, that it replaces faith in the divine with faith in humanity's future. I have to say, I've never entirely understood what they mean, but I think maybe the answer is in there, somewhere. Only in this very specific sense. Communism doesn't dangle any promises of eternal bliss or reward. The only promise it offers is that the future can be better than the past, if we're willing to work and fight and die for it. Then you don't believe in the historic role of the proletariat, which also means you reject the basis of historical materialism.
It means you are not a communist, in other words.
Something else. I guess you could say we believe it because it's impossible. It's our way of saying we refuse to accept that the world has to remain. Like this. Yes, that's a good way to think of it. A work in progress. A thought can be a very powerful thing. That's the whole idea of inframaterialism.
Finally, the cynicism that this game spends so much time mired in is inverted. Yes, the belief that it's possible to make the world a better place involves a level of faith against the odds that it might as well be comparable to a sort of religion. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. Staban implies that if you're not willing to stick to your ideals in the face of the powers that be, then you don't actually hold those ideals. That, as hard as it might be, that you might as well, because the alternative, moralism, ultraliberalism, fascism, are such self-serving ideologies that it's hard to see what about them makes life worth living. That a hard, honest life of struggle is worth it for the benefit of humanity, even if it doesn't result in any seismic shifts by the end of your lifetime. This conclusion may not provide the simple comfort of the ideologies previously discussed, but it hits as one of the most pure, unguarded moments of the game, an intentionally sharp contrast to the ugliness so much of it is dedicated to exploring.
It's Indian here too. Oh, and gendarme. One last thing. About that question you asked earlier. It reminded me of a certain poem that you might appreciate.
Ah, so he has read something besides his books of abstruse theory.
It was written by a young communard who was killed on the barricades during the coalition landings. The story goes that he wrote it on the last night of his life, keeping watch from the barricades in the middle of the night. I don't have the whole thing committed to memory, but there's a line in it I think about sometimes. In dark times, should the stars also go out? Anyway, good night to you.
So, up to this point, I've focused on particular characters and the ideologies they represent, as this is ultimately my main focus. I've discussed significant sections of the overall plot as it's relevant to these characters and ideas, but there are other sections I've barely touched on at all. This is necessary to some extent. Disco Elysium is a big game. There are apparently over 1 million words in the text, which is way more than any novel I've ever read. There will absolutely be important and worthwhile things from this game that I simply won't discuss because this thing is already unwieldy enough. But I do think that before we discuss the end of the game, which wraps up everything I've been building towards, it's worth briefly summarizing the plot up to this point. If you've played this game, it may have been a while, and if you haven't, then you're probably pretty lost about what actually happens in the game. So very quickly, here we go. Through your investigations, you learn a few things. As mentioned before, the murdered man, Lely, was one of the mercenaries that Wild Pines hired to break up the strike. These mercenaries are dangerous people. Hardened soldiers, war criminals, professional sociopaths. Lely was a little different. He wasn't any less horrible than the others, but he was a little more likable, and he ended up getting involved with Clausier, a woman hiding out in Martinez in an attempt to escape litigation from her previous employer. One night, as Clausier and Lely were having sex, Lely was shot in the head. From the broken window leading toward Clausier's balcony, it's reasonably assumed that the shooter, whoever they were, was on the balcony. If the cops, us, arrived and this were the story, we'd naturally have arrested Clausier as the prime suspect in Lely's murder, as she had no alibi and no witness to prove it could have been anyone other than her. So the Hardy Boys stage a lynching, claiming that Lely raped Clausier, and that as the arbiters of justice in Martinez, they simply did their duty. At the same time that we're investigating this mystery, there are a few side plots that you can explore if you so choose, and I did. One of them involved helping some kids start a dance club in an abandoned church. It's almost completely unrelated to my focus for this video, so I won't say anything more about it except that dancing with Andre and Kim is one of the greatest moments of pure joy I've experienced in a game in a while, and that's certainly worth mentioning when we're talking about looking past the bleakness of this game's presentation. The other story would seemingly be similarly unimportant, but it's not. In fact, it's vital to the end and the message that the game leaves us with. Lena and Morel are the aforementioned two old cryptozoologists who enlist you in their hunt for the Insulindian phasmid, a stick bug-like cryptid. They're two of the most likable characters in the game, and though the likelihood of actually finding this legendary creature seemed extremely low, their enthusiasm and their warmth made me want to believe. I helped them as much as I could, checking traps multiple times, but in the end, we had to give up on our quixotic quest. Or so I thought. More on this later. Another important aspect of this game, also a bit outside of the main scope of this video, but worth mentioning for the sake of the end, is the existential questioning it keeps coming back to. Your messy breakup from a few years ago led to your alcoholic downward spiral, and while this is probably one of the least interesting aspects of the story for me personally, it feels a bit cliche. Your brushes with death, substance abuse, and forgetting seem to open you up to a kind of spiritual curiosity and terror. You have a skill called Inland Empire, one of the main skills I invested points into, that allows you to see beyond corporeal existence and gain insight into the secrets of the cosmos. For all its politics and its pessimism, Disco Elysium is also obsessed with the big questions. Who are we, these blind, violent consciousnesses attached to dying bodies? Why are we here? What is our purpose in the grand scheme of the universe? Many of these ideas are embodied in the concept of the Pale, a growing area of lifeless, matterless space that breaks down the rules of reality and thought, a chaotic void encroaching on human life. The Pale is a mystery in the world of Elysium, one that the game offers few concrete explanations for. We'll come back to this concept later as well. Anyway, back to the main plot. Under pressure, Clausier admits to us that she wasn't raped, and Titus's story falls apart. We're not sure who the murderer is, but the most obvious suspect is Ruby, the 8th Hardy Boy, who was in love with Clausier. We managed to track her down, but after being attacked by her pale compressor, we get enough out of her to suggest that she's not the killer. She threatens to kill herself, but I managed to talk her out of it under the condition that I just let her walk away and not come back. We return to town just in time to witness the tribunal. Lely's former friends finally decide to enact retribution on the Hardy Boys. There's a few different ways this can go, but they're all varying levels of disaster. I fully admit to save scumming in this game. Sorry, I simply was not okay with Elizabeth dying. And I think the situation I ended up with was probably one of the best I could hope for. Several of the Hardy Boys still die, but so do the mercenaries. Elizabeth, Titus, Kim, and a few others survived in my playthrough. I was injured, but I'm not sure that this had any actual consequences for the rest of the game besides being knocked out for a couple days. So, where does this leave us? With most suspects dead, missing, or ruled out, we're unsure where to go from here, but Clausier leaves one hint for us before she runs away. That, though the bullet definitely came through the window, the shot itself may not have come from the balcony. It may have been a sniper. This is a line of inquiry I had already explored, having examined the window and tracking down a few possible trajectories. But it's not until here that the final possible trajectory is actually possible to explore. A small island, only reachable from Lillian's boat, which we can now borrow. It's slightly frustrating, honestly, that the game doesn't unlock this option until the very end. It was pretty clear to me where I had to go and what I needed to do before the tribunal, but the game didn't present the option. It's a pretty open-ended game overall, but there are definitely some plot beats that you're forced into. On this island, we fairly quickly find our mysterious sniper, Josef Lilianovich Dross, the deserter. It doesn't take much convincing to get him to start talking and finally fill in the rest of the picture for us. Josef was a communist soldier back in the revolution a half a century ago, but in a moment of weakness, he ran. He didn't abandon his ideals, or at least not the echo of them. He still talks like a hardline proponent of Mazovian socioeconomics, still acts as if his actions are being driven on their behalf. But when faced with the likelihood of death on the battlefield all those years ago, he found his body betraying his brain. He hid out on this island, or another one of the many in this area, and stayed there, isolated from society for the rest of his life. He hid first from his commanding officers as a deserter, but once the communists were deposed, he then continued hiding from the coalition government, which rounded up and executed any remaining communists they could find. He lived as a shadow for the rest of his life, scrounging for food and voyeuristically watching people live their lives from the scope of his rifle. Josef's identity is a festering wound of atrophied historical and political anachronisms fueled by self-hatred and bitter misanthropy. He hates everyone. Of course he hates the coalition and the capitalists, but he doesn't hate the union particularly less, dismissing Everard as a mere social democrat. He hates anyone who moved on with their lives after the war, the way that so many seem to find it so easy to adjust to their new moralist masters. He hates Renee, an old soldier around the same age and equally hateful, but who fought for the opposite side. He hates the mercenaries, dogs of the ultra-liberals that they are. He hates Clausier too, though he also seems to have been infatuated with her. He spied on her and Lely, not just through his scope, but through a peephole in the hotel itself. When he pulled the trigger on Lely, he justified it as a political act against a violent reactionary, but it was really an act of jealousy, a spiteful and confused final statement from a rancorous, perverted, dying old man. Yosef is another relic, another reminder of Revachol's bloody past that it can't escape, just like the bullet-ridden architecture. He's a ghost haunting Martinez, twisted and malevolent. He's perhaps the most pessimistic depiction Disco Elysium contains, saved for the climax as a nihilistic twist to the murder mystery. Now that we know he's the murderer, the meaninglessness and randomness of this whole set of events is revealed. There was no secret plot to set them in motion. This is the equivalent of an old, forgotten landmine suddenly going off all these years later, but all the parties affected wanted to see it as something more. He's one final statement about how people can use their ideologies to justify the most pitiful and harmful of existences. In that sense, it's important that he's a communist. These are the good guys. These are the heroes of kids like Steban, people who fought and died for the liberation of humanity. The fact that they lost isn't supposed to matter. What matters is supposed to be the act itself. But Yosef's ideology has been removed of its meaning for as long as he's been removed from society, a distorted reflection of its promise for a better tomorrow, used now as nothing more than an excuse for empty acts of violence. If the game were to end on this note, the bleakness of the moment would easily drown out all the small slivers of hope that have brought us all this way. But Disco Elysium has one final surprise waiting for us. Behind the deserter, we see, emerging from the reeds, the Insulindian phasmid. I, naturally, confirmed with Kim to make sure that he was seeing it too. It wouldn't be the first time I hallucinated something that no one else could see. But miraculously, he could see it, and was just as, if not more, at awe of it than I was. He even takes a picture, one that he's able to show others later. The Insulindian phasmid is real. It exists. This is the first thing it tells us when we speak to it. What do we learn from the phasmid? It's difficult to say in concrete terms. It shares with us impressions of its unique and ancient existence, seemingly at least partially free of the constant consciousness that humans are cursed with. Day in and day out, asleep or awake, the awareness of existence of the world and the universe, the constant input we are forced to take in. It seems in awe of us, respectful of this unimaginable burden we must carry. It also tells us that we are likely the cause of the Pale, that it didn't exist before we did, as if our awareness of our existence manifested its own limits. It's not exactly a comforting thought, and yet meeting the phasmid is a beautifully transcendent moment. Here, we're face to face with one of the mysteries of the universe, choosing to make itself known to us. It offers no easy answers, but the existence of some form of libidined answers is in itself its own kind of consolation, as if in this moment the universe feels a little less cold and empty, as wondrous as it seemed in some half-remembered past before the terror set in. The phasmid is beautiful and alien, speaking to us in a cute, childlike voice about the nature of human consciousness. Being a scholar of the more esoteric forms of Mazovian studies that I am, the idea of thoughts manifesting the realities around us sounded familiar, not too far off from the idea of inframaterialism that I had read and discussed with the communist students. Could this being be confirming the reality of this once impossible sounding theory? Even if it's not, doesn't the very existence of the phasmid, a creature no one except Lena, Morel, and me believed in, confirm how little we really know about the possibilities contained in the universe, that no matter how far-fetched an idea seems, no matter how few people believe in it, it could still one day reveal itself as real and tangible as anything else around us? If the phasmid can exist, then surely one day we could really, truly build communism. The simple yearning for a better future couldn't possibly be out of our reach, knowing what we know now, right? Meeting the phasmid is not the final scene of the game. We eventually return to the island where we're confronted by Harry's longtime partner who believes him to be unfit for duty. This scene acts as a kind of summation and review, not only of any loose plot threads, but of the decisions the player made along the way. It's a good and probably necessary scene, but the true climax of the game, the moment that stuck with me long after the credits rolled, was the phasmid. The phasmid is the gift waiting for us at the end of this sordid, demoralizing quest. One beautiful moment of wonder, a confirmation that this wasn't all pointless, that there is hope out there somewhere, that it's worth pushing through everything else in order to find it. It's about as optimistic and surprising an ending to this game as we could have hoped for, and it feels incredibly well earned. Disco Elysium is a rare video game that wants to challenge us in a thematic sense rather than a mechanical one. It puts a lot of trust in the player that will work to see past its repulsive exterior to see the hope it has to offer underneath. And trust in itself that it can deliver that hope when it spends so much time obscuring it. In the end, that ratio felt appropriately reflective of our current time, a time of existential anxiety and hate and despair, as well as incredible potential. And with that, I think I've basically said what I set out to say about this massive, messy, difficult game that I love. I don't want all of my videos to be this unwieldy, but in the case of this game, I guess this length at least feels appropriate. Hopefully, whether you've played this game or not, you've gotten at least something out of this exploration of just some of Disco Elysium's plots and themes. And if you did, please like, subscribe, whatever else it is that YouTubers say, because holy shit, putting these videos together is a lot of work. And it's not like anyone asked for this from me, but it would be nice to see that at least somebody appreciated this thing. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Goodbye.